to be fair, February 2026. Something unprecedented is happening in Washington. In fact, simply put, basically, to be fair, honestly, senior military commanders are sitting at negotiating tables, not planning operations. However, conducting diplomacy. Basically, simply put, the Trump administration has made a bold move, sending uniformed military leaders to negotiate directly with Iran over its nuclear program. This breaks decades of foreign policy tradition, and it could change everything. Simply put, to understand why this matters, here's the context. In fact, simply put, if you look closely, the United States and Iran have been locked in conflict over Iran's nuclear program for over 20 years. In 2015, the Obama administration negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. But in 2018, President Trump withdrew from that agreement, calling it fundamentally flawed. If you look closely, maximum pressure sanctions returned. Iran responded by exceeding the nuclear limits that had been established. To be fair, fast forward to 2026. If you look closely, Iran's nuclear program has advanced dramatically. Enrichment levels are at concerning thresholds. To be fair, the time it would take Iran to produce enough material for a nuclear weapon has shortened to just weeks or months. The situation has reached a critical point. According to recent reports, the head of United States Central Command, the four-star general overseeing all American military operations in the Middle East, is now directly involved in Iran on nuclear talks. This is not standard procedure. Traditionally, the State Department leads such negotiations. If you look closely. However, Trump has deployed military leaders across multiple diplomatic missions. The Army Secretary is involved in Russia-Ukraine peace talks. Defense officials are handling strategic dialogues normally reserved for civilian diplomats. Simply put, why this approach? First, credibility. Simply put, military commanders understand what can actually be enforced on the ground. If you look closely when discussing security guarantees or verification, a general knows the operational realities. Second, direct communication. If you look closely, military-to-military channels cut through political rhetoric. If you look closely, professional soldiers speak a common language of capabilities and strategy. To be fair, third, enforcement. If you look closely, these leaders can design verification protocols that are actually implementable, not just theoretical. Iran comes to these talks from a complex position. To be fair, on one hand, they have built significant nuclear infrastructure. Thousands of centrifuges operate in facilities across the country. Enrichment has reached 60% purity, far beyond what civilian power needs and approaching the 90% threshold for weapons-grade material. Iran also maintains influence across the Middle East through proxy groups in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. Simply put, if you look closely, to be fair, also Syria. The Strait of Hormuz, carrying 1/5 of global oil supplies, sits along Iran's coast. But Iran is also economically strangled. To be fair, decades of sanctions have devastated the economy. To be fair, oil exports are severely restricted. The currency has collapsed. Public discontent is growing. For the United States, the stakes are equally high. Preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons remains a top national security priority. To be fair, if you look closely, however, the options are narrowing diplomacy or military action are increasingly the only choices. What needs to be resolved? The core issues are technically complex but strategically basic. Iran's enrichment levels must come down. Stockpiles of enriched uranium must be reduced or removed. To be fair, advanced centrifuges need to be addressed. If you look closely, also critically verification must be established. International inspectors need access to facilities, including potentially military sites. Iran wants sanctions relief, but the United States insists on phased relief tied to verified compliance. Neither side trusts the other. Then there are regional complications. The United States and Gulf partners want any deal to address Iran's ballistic missiles and regional activities. To be fair, Iran refuses, saying these are separate issues. To be fair, Saudi Arabia and the UAE watch nervously, wanting guarantees that any agreement will not empower Iran regionally. Israel views Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat and has made clear it reserves the right to act independently if diplomacy fails. Honestly, time is running out. Honestly, intelligence assessments suggest Iran could produce enough material for a weapon within months if they decided to sprint toward that goal. The use of military leaders in these negotiations is both pragmatic and controversial. In fact, the practical argument is strong. The Middle East hosts truly massive American military presence, the Fifth Fleet, multiple air bases, special operations forces throughout the region. Honestly, in fact, to be fair, if you look closely, any agreement with Iran must account for these forces. The commanders responsible for them understand the security requirements better than anyone. Honestly, military leaders can also design realistic monitoring and enforcement. Basically, they know what intelligence capabilities can actually detect. They understand response options if Iran violates terms. Basically, they can negotiate security arrangements that are operationally sound, not just diplomatically elegant, honestly. However, critics worry about military zing foreign policy. Simply put, they argue diplomatic expertise matters. That uniformed personnel conducting negotiations sends the wrong message and sidelines critical State Department experience. If you look closely, the outcome of these talks will reshape Middle Eastern security for years. In fact, success could reduce military tensions, create space for broader regional dialogue. Also potentially shift resources from military spending toward economic development. To be fair, it could prevent a nuclear arms race in one of the world's most volatile regions. In fact, failure could be catastrophic. If you look closely, Saudi Arabia has indicated it might pursue its own nuclear program if Iran develops weapons. Honestly, other Gulf states could follow. To be fair, the prospect of multiple Middle Eastern nuclear programs creates nightmare proliferation scenarios. A diplomatic collapse could also trigger military confrontation. Israel has conducted strikes on Iranian facilities before and possesses the capability to do so again. If you look closely, simply put, honestly, the United States maintains substantial military forces in the region. As of February 2026, these negotiations remain in early stages. Initial discussions focus on technical parameters, on confidence-building measures. Conversations center on enrichment levels, inspection protocols. In fact, also stockpile management. Honestly, these represent the foundation for any broader agreement. If you look closely, simply put, behind the scenes back channels explore what each side truly needs versus what they publicly demand. Regional consultations proceed in parallel. American officials engage Gulf partners to address concerns and secure support. To be fair, European allies whose participation in sanctions relief is essential are being consulted. The timeline remains uncertain. Optimists suggest preliminary agreements could emerge within months. To be fair, simply put, pessimists note that fundamental trust gaps may prove impossible to bridge. The Trump administration's decision to deploy military leaders to Iran nuclear negotiations is a high-stakes gamble. It breaks diplomatic convention, but offers potential advantages in practical expertise and enforcement credibility. The coming months will determine whether this unconventional approach succeeds where traditional diplomacy has struggled. Simply put, if you look closely, the stakes are enormous: nuclear proliferation, regional stability. Also, global security all hang in the balance. This is diplomacy by other means. Also the world is watching.